My cat, a quiet kitty, jumped over the fence and stayed for a few minutes in the neighbor's yard. Any normal person would just ignore it or give it back, but not this woman. She called the police claiming criminal trespass and tried to make me pay a nuisance fine. If there's one thing I've learned living in this neighborhood, it's that there's always someone willing to turn anything normal into a problem. This time, the target was my cat. Yes, my cat. A four-legged furry animal that spends 90% of its time sleeping and the other 10% trying to decide whether to ignore me or tolerate me. The story begins on a Saturday morning. One of those perfect days. The sun was shining, the weather was pleasant, and I, Emma Mitchell, was quietly enjoying my coffee while watching my cat Milo take his classic morning stroll around the yard. He's an explorer by birth, always curious, always venturing a little beyond the territory I'd like. And that's when it happened. He jumped over the fence and ended up in the neighbor's yard. Any normal person would simply pick up the cat and return it to her, maybe even pet it first. But not this woman. Oh no, that would have been too easy. It was only a matter of minutes before I heard a high-pitched scream, the kind that usually indicates that someone has found a flying cockroach in the bathroom. I ran to see what was going on, and to my utter disbelief, there was Mrs. Constance Abernathy standing in her yard as if she had just caught a serial killer. But the villain, Milo the cat, he was lying lazily on her lawn, in no hurry to get out of there. Mrs. Abernathy pointed at him with an expression of horror, as if she were dealing with a wild bear invading her property. "Your cat is in my yard," she shouted, her voice filled with indignation. I blinked a few times, hoping the sentence would make more sense, but it didn't. I looked at Milo, who was completely oblivious to the drama, licking a paw with the serenity of someone who doesn't give a damn about human problems. "Okay," I replied, still trying to understand the level of madness I was dealing with. She started gesticulating as if she was about to collapse. She said that animals couldn't invade private property, that this was a home invasion, and that I was irresponsible for allowing such a thing. All this while Milo yawned. That's when I heard a screen door slide open from the house on the other side of my yard. "Morning, Emma. Everything okay over there?" It was Dave Johnson, my other next-door neighbor, a retired attorney in his 60s with salt and pepper hair and the kind of calm demeanor that comes from decades of dealing with difficult people in court. "Mrs. Abernathy is upset because Milo wandered into her yard," I explained, gesturing toward my lounging cat. Dave wandered over, coffee mug in hand, and surveyed the situation. "That's what this commotion is about. Okete kingonop." Mrs. Abernathy turned her fury toward Dave. "This isn't about a nap. It's about property rights and irresponsible pet ownership." At first, I thought it was a passing exaggeration, but then she pulled out her cell phone and started dialing a number. And that's when I realized that things were about to get completely out of hand. Dave's expression changed. "Constance, you're not seriously calling the authorities over this, are you?" The scene was so absurd that it took my brain a while to process. Mrs. Abernathy, still looking like she had just caught a heinous crime, was typing on her cell phone with an urgency that I imagined was reserved for real emergencies. But no, she was actually calling the police. For a second, I thought maybe she was pretending just to scare me, but no, she was taking it seriously. Dave leaned closer to me and whispered, "You should know, she's done this before. Last year, she tried to sue the Henderson family because their Christmas lights were too bright. While she was waiting to be attended to, she started walking around in circles in her yard, huffing and throwing disgusted glances at Milo, who, poor thing, was still completely oblivious to the fact that he was about to be booked as a high-risk criminal. The cat, by the way, didn't even seem to notice the commotion. He was lying on the grass, occasionally stretching out and changing position as if testing the best angles for a nap. It wasn't until I heard her saying the words trespassing and aggressive animal to the attendant on the other end of the line that I realized this story was going too far. She spoke as if a hungry lion had jumped over the fence and was about to devour half the neighborhood. I looked at Milo. He yawned and went back to sleep. Yes, clearly a violent and dangerous animal. "This is ridiculous," Dave muttered. "Emma, I'm sorry, but maybe I should mention something. The town actually does have a leash law for all animals, cats included. Most people ignore it for cats, but technically..." "Are you serious?" I replied, shocked that Dave seemed to be giving any credence to Mrs. Abernathy's outburst. "I'm just saying..." "Legally speaking, she's not entirely off base," he said, though her reaction is completely disproportionate. Great. Now I had Mrs. Abernathy treating my cat like a fugitive from justice and my only potential ally, citing obscure pet ordinances. After hanging up, Mrs. Abernathy crossed her arms and stared at me with that superior look, as if she had just done society a great favor, as if at that very moment she was preventing a crime of epic proportions. I could have taken Milo and ended it there, but you know what? Part of me wanted to see how far it would go. The level of insanity was so great that I felt almost obliged to watch this story unfold. And then, 10 minutes later, a car did indeed appear on the street. 2 policemen got out of the car, and Mrs. Abernathy practically ran up to them, gesticulating frantically as she pointed at the 4-legged criminal. The most impressive thing? She seemed to really believe she was right. By this time, several other neighbors had emerged from their homes, drawn by the commotion. A small crowd had gathered on the sidewalk, watching the scene unfold with a mixture of amusement and disbelief. The officers, who were probably expecting to deal with something real, took a few seconds to understand that they were there to resolve a territorial dispute between a paranoid woman and a cat who had no idea what was going on. One of the officers looked at me, then at Milo, who was still lying in the same place, and then at Mrs. Abernathy, who was talking as if she were reporting a bank robbery. His expression said it all. Why did I choose this profession? But the best part was yet to come, because against all odds, they really began to treat it as a legitimate calling. And that's when it got even more absurd. Ma'am, one of the officers began, addressing me. Do you understand that there are leash laws in this county? Dave shot me a knowing look, as if to say, I told you so. If one day I had to imagine the most ridiculous scene possible involving law enforcement, it would never come close to what was happening there. 2 policemen, a notepad, an indignant neighbor. And at the center of it all, Milo, a cat who at that moment was more interested in cleaning his own paw than in his supposed criminal history. Mrs. Abernathy continued to pour out her litany, gesticulating as if she had caught an international trafficking scheme. She said it wasn't just a cat in her yard, but a security threat. She claimed that Milo could be carrying diseases, that he could be aggressive, and that above all, it was a home invasion. Yes, a home invasion. I've had 3 panic attacks since moving here because of this beast, she declared, her voice trembling for dramatic effect. I have a severe cat phobia. My doctor has documented it. From the back of the small crowd, someone murmured, then why did she move next door to someone with a cat? Others hushed them. One of the policemen, who already seemed to be questioning all the choices that had led him to this point in his life, sighed deeply and looked at me. His partner, trying to maintain a modicum of professionalism, was jotting down a few things on his notepad. Apparently, Milo was about to have a criminal record. I could have solved everything right there. I could have simply picked Milo up and put an end to the clowning. But by then, the situation had turned into such a wonderful theater of the absurd that I wanted to see how it would end. Dave stepped forward, his lawyer instincts kicking in. Officers, while there is technically a leash law, it's important to note that the statute was primarily designed for dogs and other animals that pose an actual threat. A common house cat hardly constitutes a public menace. Some neighbors nodded in agreement. Others looked uncertain. A threat is a threat. Mrs. Abernathy shot back. And I'm deathly allergic. One exposure could send me to the hospital. This was new information. If she truly had severe allergies, maybe her reaction, while extreme, wasn't entirely unfounded. The woman, realizing that she needed an even more convincing argument, decided to appeal to the emotional. She said that she had a real fear of cats and that Milo's presence caused her unbearable stress. This, of course, while she was less than a meter away from the cat, who didn't even deign to open his eyes to acknowledge her existence. The policeman taking notes looked at his partner, then at me, and finally turned to her. Ma'am, has the cat left your yard yet? The question was a watershed because at that moment, Milo, with absolutely perfect timing, decided he was bored of the neighbor's lawn and came back to my side without any haste, without any consideration for the chaos he had caused. He just jumped over the fence back into my yard, sat down, and started licking himself as if he was cleaning up any trace of the human idiocy he had had to deal with. Mrs. Abernathy went mute for the first time. She realized that her affair was falling apart, but of course, she wasn't going to give up so easily. She looked at me, then at the policeman, and then with an air of forced victory, she unleashed the worst threat of all. I'm going to take this to City Hall. Yes, she wanted to involve the government in this, and honestly, I couldn't wait to see how far this insanity would go. As the police officers prepare to leave, issuing me only a verbal warning about the leash law, Dave pulled me aside. Emma, I know this seems completely insane, and it is, but I should warn you, Constance has a history of taking things to extremes. She's filed 3 lawsuits against neighbors in her previous community. She's what we in the legal profession call a vexatious litigant. You're kidding, I said. Over what? One was over a hedge being 2 inches too tall. Another was about wind chimes being too loud. She actually won that one on a technicality. Great. So I wasn't just dealing with a cranky neighbor. I was dealing with a serial complainant with legal experience. If you think logic would return to this story, I'm sorry. Mrs. Abernathy really took the threat seriously and decided that the next step in her crusade against my cat would be to get the city government involved. The most impressive thing was her dedication. The next day, I received an official email from the city's animal control department. At first, I thought it was a hoax, but no. The woman had actually filed a formal complaint claiming that Milo was an invasive animal and that I should be held responsible for him. I didn't know what was more absurd. The fact that she had wasted her time doing this, or the fact that someone in the town hall had read it and thought, yes, this deserves to be registered. In the same email, I was informed that an inspector would pay a visit to assess the situation. In other words, someone with a badge and a clipboard would come to my house to investigate whether my cat, a being that weighs less than a sack of rice, was a public threat. This is getting out of hand, Dave said when I showed him the email later that day. But don't worry. I know the animal control officer. Jim's a reasonable guy. I appreciate your help, I said, but I'm still confused why you're playing both sides here. First you tell me she has a point about the leash law, then you're helping me? Dave sighed. Look, I'm a firm believer in property rights. If I'm being honest, I do think pet owners should be more responsible about keeping their animals on their own property. But Constance's reaction is completely disproportionate to the situation. There's a principle at stake here, and it's about reasonable behavior. His nuanced take made me think. Was I being completely responsible as a pet owner? Maybe not. But did that justify this level of reaction? Absolutely not. And so, 2 days later, a middle-aged man looking like he had seen everything in his life appeared at my door. He was holding some papers and greeted me with a look of sheer exhaustion. I asked him to come in, and then he began to explain in the most robotic tone possible that he needed to check whether Milo posed a risk of reoffending. Yes, they used the word recidivism to describe a cat that had taken the wrong nap. As he spoke, Milo emerged from the kitchen, walked quietly over to the sofa, and lay down, completely oblivious to the fact that he was being investigated by the government. The inspector looked at him, looked at me, and let out a long sigh, the kind that carries years of professional frustration. He took out a sheet of paper and began to read Mrs. Abernathy's allegations. Some of the pearls included: the cat invaded my property without permission. Of course, because everyone knows that cats sign contracts before going for a walk. It could be spreading disease. Funny that she never had a problem with the birds and squirrels in her yard. It made my blood pressure go up with nerves. If that was a crime, what about rush hour traffic? The inspector glanced down at his papers. There's also a medical affidavit here claiming she has severe cat allergies and a phobia documented by a Dr. Wilson. This gave me pause. A documented medical issue changed things somewhat. I've never heard her mention allergies until yesterday, I said. She's been living next door for 6 months, and this is the first incident. After a few minutes of filling in the paperwork, he simply looked at me and said, I have to ask, do you think you can keep the cat from getting out of the yard? The ideal answer would have been, oh sure, I'll sit down with him and explain the rules of society. But for some reason, I didn't think sarcasm would help. I replied that I would try to keep Milo inside more often, and he nodded, clearly just wanted to get it over with. He filled in one last form and said that the case would probably be dropped. But before he left, he made a final comment that made me laugh alone afterwards. Look, I've dealt with bizarre complaints before, but this is new. And with that, Milo was officially cleared by the government. But Mrs. Abernathy wasn't going to accept this defeat so easily. After the inspector's visit, I thought the story had finally come to an end. Milo had been cleared. The city government had clearly realized that it was all a big joke, and I was ready to get on with my life without having to deal with any more insanity. But as always, I underestimated this woman's ability to take things too far. 3 days later, as I was leaving for work, I noticed a piece of paper taped to my door. A formal notice from a neighborhood association. Do you know what her new invention was? A petition to ban Milo from a neighborhood. Yes. She decided that since the police and the town hall had done nothing, it was time to take the case to the Supreme Court of old neighborhood gossips. In the document, she claimed that my cat was a continual nuisance and suggested that he be banned from the neighborhood, as if Milo were a juvenile delinquent in need of a court order to keep his distance from society. Best or worst of all, some people signed it, not because they agreed, but because nobody wanted to argue with this woman. She was the type who knocked on people's doors at 7 in the morning demanding signatures and threatening to report anyone who refused. When I showed the petition to Dave, he was genuinely conflicted. Look, Emma, I think Constance is being completely unreasonable, but I've been talking to some of the other neighbors, and there are legitimate concerns about outdoor cats. They kill birds, they dig in gardens. Are you serious right now? I interrupted. You're actually considering signing her petition? I didn't say that, he replied defensively. I'm just saying this situation isn't as black and white as it seems. I was shocked. It's a cat taking a nap, Dave. Not exactly a national crisis. He sighed. Just consider an outdoor enclosure for Milo, okay? It would solve a lot of problems. I decided that I had put up with enough of this madness. I took the petition and did exactly what any sensible person would do. I scanned it and posted it online. The title of the post: My neighbor wants to deport my cat. Within hours, the post went viral. People from all over the world were commenting on the absurdity of the situation, laughing at the idea of a cat being treated like an escaped criminal. Some suggested that I make a passport for Milo with an official stamp of permanent residency in the neighborhood. Others said we should make a statue to honor the first cat in the world to almost be banished from a neighborhood. But the internet reaction wasn't uniformly on my side. A small but vocal minority started asking questions. Why don't you just keep your cat inside? Would you let your dog run free in the neighborhood? What if someone in the neighborhood has severe allergies? The repercussion was so great that it reached some local newspapers. A news website ran a short story about the cat expelled from his own town, and a local radio station approached me to find out if the story was real. What I hadn't expected was that people would actually show up. Yes, real human beings decided to take time out of their day to come to our neighborhood and protest in support of Milo's freedom. About 20 people gathered outside my house with handmade signs. Free Milo. Cats against fascism. Meow means meow. This, of course, only made the situation more tense. Mrs. Abernathy was furious at the attention, and some of my other neighbors were annoyed at the disruption. Dave was particularly upset. This is exactly what I was worried about, he said. Now we got chaos in the neighborhood over what should have been a simple conversation between neighbors. The neighborhood association called an emergency meeting to address the Milo situation. As it was now officially known, the community center was packed. I had never seen so many people attend a neighborhood meeting. Mrs. Abernathy arrived with a thick folder of evidence, and a woman she introduced as Dr. Wilson, apparently the doctor who had documented her cat allergy and phobia. Mrs. Abernathy experienced a severe allergic reaction after the feline incursion onto her property. Dr. Wilson explained to the room. Her airways began to close, and she nearly had to use her emergency epinephrine injector. This was the first I'd heard of any medical emergency. Looking around the room, I could see that this revelation was changing some people's perspectives. What had seemed like a ridiculous overreaction might actually have been a legitimate health concern. When it was my turn to speak, I felt the energy in the room had shifted against me. I understand concerns about allergies. I began, but Milo was in her yard for less than 5 minutes. If Mrs. Abernathy is so severely allergic, why didn't she mention this from the beginning instead of calling the police and claiming home invasion? The debate went back and forth, with neighbors taking sides. Some defended a cat's natural instinct to roam, while others emphasized the importance of respecting property boundaries and health concerns. It was no longer just about a cat. It had become a proxy battle for larger community values. In the end, the association reached a compromise. I would build an outdoor catio enclosure for Milo that would allow him outside time while keeping him contained, and Mrs. Abernathy would drop her complaint. When the neighbor realized that her name was being dragged around the internet, she went into full panic mode. From one moment to the next, she tried to pretend nothing had happened and started avoiding any eye contact with me. For the first time, she seemed to realize that she had overreacted a lot. As I was building Milo's new outdoor enclosure, a project that Dave surprisingly volunteered to help with, Mrs. Abernathy approached us cautiously. I want you to know, she began stiffly, that I may have reacted more strongly than the situation warranted. Dave nearly dropped the hammer he was holding. I just stared in disbelief. My therapist says I need to be more forthcoming about my anxiety disorders, she continued. I do have a severe cat phobia from childhood trauma, but I should have handled it differently. This moment of vulnerability from a woman who had been nothing but hostile was genuinely shocking. I didn't forgive her completely. She had, after all, tried to have my pet banished, but I understood her a little better. And Milo? Well, he was still a cat. I didn't even know he was an internet icon. He seemed perfectly content with his new outdoor enclosure, which gave him plenty of space to lounge in the sun without venturing into hostile territory. The last time I saw Mrs. Abernathy, she still crossed the street to avoid me, which is great because honestly, after all this, I was expecting her to try to sue me for illegal cat storage. Dave, who had been so frustratingly neutral throughout the whole ordeal, finally admitted, I think I was too hard on you, Emma. Yes, pet owners should be responsible. But some things just aren't worth the fight. So you're saying I was right? I asked with a smile. I'm saying, he replied carefully, that both sides had points worth considering. But life's too short for cat deportation hearings. Moral of the story. If you want to live in peace, never underestimate someone's ability to turn a simple cat into a national security problem. But also, sometimes the most ridiculous conflicts have layers that aren't immediately obvious. Have you ever had to deal with a crazy neighbor who thinks she runs the world? Or do you think pet owners should keep better control of their animals? The comments on this story are always divided. Some viewers think Mrs. Abernathy was completely unhinged, while others think I should have kept Milo indoors from the beginning. Let us know in the comments, and if you like this story, subscribe to the channel and leave a like for more stories like this. Want more absurdities like this? Click on the card and let's watch. See you in the next video.